I'm in the business of wanting to resurrect that triumphant beast in you.
Welcome to the Boundless Body, the podcast with a somatic doctor interviewing innovative thinkers about their perspectives relating to the arts and sciences of therapy. Discover the Boundless Body.
Back to the mystery.
Okay, so I'm really excited to have on the show today Nikki Heyder. Welcome, Nikki.
Thank you.
To the Boundless Body, where one of the questions, the core questions that we're asking here is, what can a body do? It's simple, but very profound question. Huh? What can a body do?
Yeah. It is. Incredibly simple and profound.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so I'm going to read this intro, and then we're just going to roll into a creative discussion. So Nikki Heyder is a holistic somatic psychotherapist, a yoga teacher, and a mentor. She has worked with a wide range of mental health issues within various settings, including drug and alcohol rehabilitation, private clinics, and retreats. Along with her postgraduate qualifications in counseling psychology, Nikki is certified in compassionate inquiry, having completed 2 years of training in somatic psychotherapy with trauma expert Dr. Gabor Mate. Nikki lives in Bali, Indonesia, where she teaches yoga, trains yoga teachers, and coaches in trauma-informed care. She also works individually with clients from across the globe and facilitates an in-depth coaching certification. Nikki also has a book release coming out in October with a lovely, lovely title, which I think is quite humble and wonderful, and the book is called Good Enough, which I think is lovely. You know, in psychology, we have this term called the good enough mother, right? That's probably what you're referring to, right?
I mean, it definitely comes up in the book. The interesting thing was I started writing the book when I was pregnant, and I finished the book when Bodhi was 2. And so I actually, when I was editing it one of the final times, I actually inserted a whole chunk in there about good enough birth and good enough mothering and good enough all of this, because the whole book is about the fact that anyone and everyone that I speak to in my years of practicing as a therapist is that it always comes down to this belief of I'm just not good enough, or I'm too much and therefore I'm not good enough, you know?
It's a great sensibility. It's a humble sensibility. You know, sometimes I think we're really just floating in an ocean, a kind of quasi-aggressive ocean of ideals and opinions, you know, and these ideals and opinions are constantly tugging at us. And we can never really, if that's true, if we're living in an ocean of ideals aren't really achievable. You know what I mean? And if ideals aren't achievable and we're in an ocean of ideals, then wherever we turn, we're not going to be living up to those ideals.
No, exactly. And a lot of the book is just about that pursuit of living up to expectations that either don't exist or that are actually not what we really want. You know, like a lot of the time we have beliefs that we should be a certain way, but then when you really kind of work with someone on that, they're like, but I don't really want that. And you're like, well, okay. You know, well, you're kind of pursuing really the wrong thing. And that's why you feel so disconnected. So the book is about just unpacking that and helping readers to understand in a very practical, very layman's terms, like, why does this happen? Where does it come from? And what can we do about it? And how do we move more into a space of just self-acceptance and self-compassion and be here and enjoy being here with what we have and know what our values are and learn to live from that place instead.
It's very earthy. I quite like it. You know, one of the ideals that I wanted to challenge over time as a craniosacral teacher is the ideal of the centered human, the self-regulated human. Mm-hmm. As ideals go, it's a decent ideal. Mm-hmm. And it's still an ideal, right? Yeah. So did you explore that at all?
I mean, we do a lot of understanding. There's a lot of understanding of the nervous system, but there's also a lot of, it's not reasonable to expect that you're going to do this work on meditation and somatics and healing, and that you're going to live life like a Zen Buddhist, like it's not something that we live in in a world where there are stressors, and the body's going to react in a way where it's designed to react in a way because it's what its job is. But it's about us trying to figure out, like, when is it reacting to something that it's not being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, or it's not really in threat, it's not really in danger. And how do we, using Dr. Siegel's terminology, how do we learn to broaden our window of tolerance by regulating our nervous system, but also realizing that we're going to get anxious sometimes, we're going to get angry sometimes, we're going to feel down sometimes, we're going to cry. And this is a part of the human experience. And that's also, there's wisdom in all of that, and it's really about not making ourselves bad or wrong for having very human experiences, which I think is the essence of the book.
I really like that you mentioned Dan Siegel. Back in 2011, I really resonated with Siegel's work where he was exploring family systems, but also one way of framing the ego is that it's a system embedded in larger and larger systems. And he would say that, if integration is the goal, and that's a whole nother discussion, right? Integration can be an ideal as well. Right. But he's talking about how systems tend to fragment into too much chaos or too much rigidity. I really like that framework. That's my favorite thing from Siegel. And it does map onto this window of tolerance thing. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about the window of tolerance and what you've learned about it. And maybe you could give us an example of somebody that you've worked with where we can kind of hash out this continuum of too much chaos versus too much rigidity. Maybe an example from either side. Yeah,
for sure. Oh, you've put me on the spot to think of clients.
That's my job.
The window of tolerance, I just like that. I really love Siegel's work. I think, I as a professor, I love learning from him. I think that he has a great way of explaining things, and I really like to learn from him because he makes things very easy to understand. So I've really enjoyed my little bits and pieces of learning. I have his children's book for Bodhi. I have his parenting book, The Whole Brain Child, and No Drama Discipline. And I found them to be really helpful, for myself and my husband in understanding what's happening in Bodhi's brain and how we can help him with that integration process. But the window of tolerance is just something that I find a really simple explanation to help my clients to understand of what we're doing when we're doing nervous system regulation work. And that oftentimes when they come to a place whereby they're asking me why they're triggered so often, or why they're yelling at their husband for no reason, or why they can't stop breaking down about small things, or why they're so anxious, or why they can't sleep, or why, just the seemingly everyday life situations are throwing them, over the edge. I always love to use that terminology and to say, well, your window of tolerance is like maybe this big, you're not able to tolerate life because you are in a situation within your body where you've exhausted your capacity to be able to tolerate, to cope with everyday life, because you're dysregulated, or you're stuck in fight or flight, or you're in freeze, or you're feeling depressed, or whatever it might be. And to come back to teaching the body how to find this space of regulation again and safety again, so that we can slowly kind of broaden that window of tolerance and we can start to be more present with our lives.
Nice one. So I like to ask the question, well, window of tolerance for what? And often the answer is for the big affects, the big ticket emotions, anger and sadness. And a lot of people don't think that or in the conceptualization about window of tolerance, actually joy isn't talked about as much as something that can be overwhelming and overstimulating.
Absolutely. Excitement.
For individuals or couples interested in therapy or counseling, you can sign up for a free consultation or our newsletter for more information on integrative therapeutic modalities.
Excitement.
Yeah, joy. Yeah, all of that. Yeah. It's still an activation of the nervous system, is it not?
For sure. For sure. And I think us parents, like sometimes we're really up against the wall or up against the limits of our window of tolerance when our children are like blasting excitement and joy. And it's like, like,
yeah, literally.
And so you really have to sometimes dig, to tolerate more joy, more excitement, more stimulation so that I'm not breaking into too much chaos or rigidity. That's what I love about Siegel. It's like, okay, when I'm up against the limits of my tolerance, even if it's things like joy and excitement, that I could fragment into too much chaos where I get into an argument with my wife, or I say these rigid things to my child where it's like, no, and so
or we become rigid as well, right? We can become
for sure
rigid within ourselves. I mean, I know that also, when you're looking at like heightened sensitivity and you're looking at some of those, I mean, I'm thinking of parenting now that you mentioned that, and like, the stimulation of excitement, the stimulation of joy, the overwhelming emotions, the pitch of noise, like all of these things that can happen, and being sensitive. I definitely identify myself as being someone who has, sensory processing sensitivity in many ways. And so for me, that window of tolerance, when I'm in that space, I can feel very overwhelmed quite quickly when all my senses are being stimulated, even if it's in a positive way. I can really have to have my downtime afterwards in order to recuperate from that.
So one of the ways that humans can fracture into rigidity, which is kind of a paradoxical statement in itself.
Fracture,
but
rigidity.
create rigidity. Like I'm thinking about the window of tolerance, like the limits there as fracturing zones, and that's where that paradox I think can dwell. Like when intensity becomes so high, a person can become so rigid, but over time, one of the ways that rigidities can accumulate is an identity. And that identity shows up in the body. So this is Wilhelm Reich, the great somatic psychologist. His insight was called character armoring. Over time, the rigidities can accumulate and become a person's identity. And it rigidifies in the body so that the body then starts to lack mobility and range to express the great affects, to be flexible and to take on other vantage points. And it really does show up in the body. So I'm just wondering if we could explore that. Because, like you live in Bali, and in Bali, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, the identity of the healer is like everybody and their mother wants to go to Bali to become like a great healer or something like that. So you must be all around. This must be all around you, this healer identity.
The healer identity is definitely very prevalent here in Bali. I think Bali is really Bali is such an interesting place. And it's interesting because, I've lived here, I grew up here. So I moved here when I was 1. And I lived here until I was about 14 before I moved off. So being there for those early years and, very formative years of my life, and being here when Bali was really predominantly still rice fields, there wasn't a lot here when I was younger. And now coming back, it's such a different place. And a lot of people have moved here, and a lot of people moved here post-COVID as well. And they've literally set up communities based on culture and based on the area that you're in and kind of what that community almost represents. So there are different pockets now of Bali that have like different identities and they attract very similar people to each kind of pocket. So you kind of know when you go here, what you're going to experience, and when you go there, what you're going to see, and when you go here, what kind of person you'll encounter. And you can almost predict it to like what kind of clothing they'll be wearing. Like it's that segmented that it's quite fascinating to observe. As an outsider and as a therapist and someone who studies human behavior, it's like quite interesting. And I live in a pocket where there hasn't been much change. I live in a pocket that my parents still live in, that there hasn't been any nightclubs built here. And it's very much this like family, it's the last built up kind of place of the main areas. And it's just interesting. Yeah, it's super interesting watching and observing these different identities. But there is definitely a big part of Bali that is obsessed with the healer identity, obsessed with it, to the point that, you know, I feel a lot of people lose who they really are because of it, because the identity takes over.
It can be paradoxically rigid in the sense that, you know, in the somatics community, what you can see is like people that are obsessed with yoga and obsessed with dance practices and movement practices, which look mobile, which look like flexible. But when you're in relationship with it, when those geometric symbols come on the shirt, you know, the clothing, you know, you see the geometric symbols and the flower of life and stuff like that. And I as at a stage in my own psychological development, and this is why I can make fun of it, I think, because I was captured by it.
Yeah.
I was captured by it. I had those geometric symbols and I'm like, I'm the mobile guy.
Yeah.
You know, like I'm the fluid guy. But the thing is that my identity was actually really rigid. And it was like, and my nose was like going up towards the sky.
Yeah.
And I didn't even realize it, right? I thought I was so humble.
Well, I mean, this is the interesting thing, is that there can be a lot of, and this is, you know, this applies to all identity groups and people who kind of are rigid in the way that they think and what they believe to be right or wrong or what have you. But I think that rigidity can really, you know, it limits critical thinking, and it really limits our ability to be subjective and objective and compassionate and really empathetic. I think we can really become very judgmental of someone else's experience without thinking, oh, but that's okay for them to have their experience and they don't need to have my experience. And I find it very hypocritical, especially in the yoga space a lot of the times, which is why I'm not a big part of the yoga community here in Bali, because, you know, in my understanding of yoga and the way that I've kind of learned about the practice and the philosophy and what have you, a big part of it is around non-judgment, and a big part of it is around compassion and non-attachment. And, you know, then you walk into a yoga class at one of these fancy yoga studios here, and there is judgment around how you're dressing or what you can and can't do and what postures you can and can't achieve and how many cacao ceremonies you've been to, and, you know, like all of these things. And you feel it, like you feel like, oh, like there's something wrong with me because I'm not up to date with the latest whatever. And for me, I just find it such a, like, it's such a, it really gets to me. And so I'm like, oh, I can't be a part of this because I find it to be hypocritical.
Yeah. I remember walking into a spiritual enclave on another island. This is the Hawaiian island, which can run some similar rigid identity vectors. I remember walking onto community land and I just met this person, and she walks up to me and she says, did you know that the plastics in the shorts that you're wearing are probably leaking into your testicles?
Oh.
And I was like, really? Oh, okay. So, we've just met and you're talking about my testicles. Well, that isn't that interesting. And there's all sorts of judgments that are lining up with ideals that are, you know, and it's like, I can't even breathe in that. Okay. Well, where do you go with that?
Well, yeah, like, I mean, yeah, it's an immediate also like it's an immediate, you belong over here because you're wearing those shorts, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. And I think this topic of identity is so interesting because we all, like, you know, you said in your own psychological journey, we've all moved through different identity shifts throughout our lives, and inevitably we will move through many more. It's interesting to observe ourselves, I think, within those shifts. Like, I know that once upon a time when I first did my yoga teacher training, you know, 10 years ago or whatever it was, my identity was very much the power vinyasa, build up a sweat. Like, it's got nothing to do with philosophy. It's all to do with just getting in there, kind of working out and feeling that sense of relief at the end of the class, but really doing it as a way to, like, a fitness type thing, and being really caught up in that and playing music and like all of these things. And I look back to that version of me, I'm like, wow, that's so interesting because it's so not how I identify myself now as a yoga teacher. And it's certainly not how I teach or practice.
Yeah. I had an era in my life where, you know, the feet could come up, you know, I could be in that. The feet could be like right here, you know, but meanwhile, my mind wasn't mobile. I couldn't see myself in my own rigidities. You know, even when the legs, and, you know, the contemplative tradition of it, the philosophical elements, it's like in somatics these days, one of the things that I like to challenge is this anti-intellectualism. The contemplative tradition that is often critical of identity over time, with its hierarchies and with its posturing and all of that stuff. And then, you know, it's interesting that in maturing, you know, it's like I'm thinking about Walt Whitman's poetry, where he says something like, I leave corpses of me behind as I grow. And that's what I think sometimes is like that guy who had, you know, these feet up like this. I actually started to develop a little bit more contemplative mobility, a little bit more. And so I like it. It's almost like a or like a locust or something like that, kind of like molting.
Yes.
You know, like molting. And it's like, I'm leaving that behind now.
Yeah.
And hopefully I don't become too judgmental of a prior developmental stage that I can end up doing now, right? Which is like, now I see the place where I was doing that stuff and I see it showing up. You know, the other day I was at the sauna or something like that, and I saw somebody walking back and forth in a kind of contemplative walking posture. And I had to descend through all these layers of, oh my God, this guy can't see how passive aggressive he is. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's so skillful, because I could see myself at age 20 or whatever, you know, just walking in what I subjectively felt was so spiritual and like so dialed and so like connected. But all I could see with this guy as I witnessed him was passive aggressiveness. And so I'm like descending through all these layers, and I'm like, oh, you know, just trying to find the humanity and my own humility so I don't succumb to the same arrogance that I'm trying to kind of expose, you know?
Yeah, I know.
It's so dynamic.
It is so dynamic. It is so dynamic. And I mean, it's just the experience of being human, isn't it? But it's fascinating. And I love the way that you explained that whole, so I can just like imagine it in my head of it playing out for you. But no, it makes perfect sense. You're absolutely right. Like, you know, recognizing who we were once upon a time, seeing it through judgmental eyes, but not wanting to, because you want to have compassion for that version of you once upon a time and for them. And it's just like, it's a very interesting place to be. I think it requires a lot of kind of rising above and seeing everything that's going on to be able to say, okay, this is how I'm going to approach this with humility, you know?
Yeah. And it's interesting to have humility as an ideal. Like all ideals, I don't really feel like there's an end result. Like, okay, now I've achieved humility and I can sort of move on or something.
No.
You know, it's a dynamic process, like how bones build themselves in our body. They're constantly, our skeletal system is constantly remodeling, right? The osteoclast and the osteoblast is really dynamic dance of death and life, really. And so I'm thinking about Bali, because I remember when I was in Bali, and I was in a village somewhere, I think I saw some ritual theater of some kind. The ritual theater is like a thing in Bali, right? Where the old masks come out and people are doing these kind of
you may have seen like the Ketchak dance, or like you may have seen like a Barong dance. They have like different types of, rituals, dances, are very much interlinked to their Hindu culture and mythology. But I'm sure you would have seen something along those lines.
And what I remember is these intense masks.
Yeah.
Like I think it's a Hira Mazda or a Hiraman or something like that, where it's like these big red masks that like, am I remembering this correctly?
Yeah. You are.
Like intense masks, you know, it's like, and I think it really, just the image of those masks is such a great contrast to the image of the kind of yoga identity mask, which is kind of like, you know, I'm centered. You know, like underneath that is like you are the other. You are the other. And, unless you come join my tribe, then I'm gonna,
And I think that's also one of the issues with the identity. Like I would say that I definitely have my own spiritual practice and spiritual beliefs. And, by no means am I saying that I've got it all figured out, but I do think that a big part of spirituality is the acceptance of the human experience as being one which is messy. And when you over-identify with spirituality as being like having this mask on that you are so enlightened that like nothing affects you, or you handle everything with grace and you don't feel anything, I think it's really doing a disservice to the experience of being human, because I think it's important to feel things and to be present with the experience. But it's like, how do we navigate that in a way where we really learn from it and evolve from it and draw lessons from it and, become okay with it, rather than it being something that is seen as non-spiritual, or, if you're looking in the context of like my book, something that's like wrong or bad. It's not wrong or bad to be angry. It's not wrong or bad to feel anxious or to be jealous sometimes or whatever. Like, it's normal. It's fine. But when we attach an identity to it where that's not allowed, I think it becomes quite dangerous, I think, actually.
Yeah, there can be this widening. I often tell students that there's a widening of the cleft between public and private.
Yes.
Where we show this mask. Even it's almost like the podcast world, pulls us into that space of, or the kind of the public space of social media pulls us into this ideal. And a weird thing is that wholeness can be an ideal too, where we can like talk about the shadowy stuff, but meanwhile we're wearing the mask, you know what I mean? And then we kind of curate the stuff that looks like the stuff we're talking about. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So if the real stuff erupts into the equation, or your little Hulkster comes into the room and starts poking your face or something like that in the middle of a podcast session, that stuff will often get curated out, right? Just because, it's all just so polished. And then you have the public like polished like this and curated, even if we're talking about the shadow of envy and the shadow of frustration or something like that, we end up curating it out. And then our private lives are what they are, is just human. We got little Hulkster coming in, or my girl being intense and bringing me right to my limits, and, and in terms of joy and in other directions as well.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think you're spot on. And it's just our lives, or the idea of who we're supposed to be is so, especially now with media in general, everything is so curated and everything is so edited. And once again, I think it's dangerous. We live, especially, I think, sometimes I see with clients of mine who are very caught up in the social media world, or I have some clients, that are in the public image, public space. And when the mask that you wear to the public is so vastly different from who you are in private, and the dual identity that you end up, the role that you're playing two different characters that are so different and actually represent two very different things, it becomes incredibly stressful for that person to maintain and to even understand who they are. Oftentimes people come to me and they say, I don't actually know who I am. And I'm like, oh, okay, well,
that's refreshing, right?
Yeah.
That's refreshing.
I don't know who I am. And it's actually really nice to work with someone as not a blank canvas, but to kind of just go back into the basics of values and the basics of like, what brings you joy and what makes you laugh. And, like all of those things that are just reminding them or bringing them back to just considering, who am I as a person, and what is it that I love and don't love, and want to be and don't want to be, and what do I believe in? And it's, it's one of my favorite parts of my job.
Yeah. that's a humble place to begin questioning, like not a ready-made answer. That's why I like the question, what can a body do?
Yeah.
Because there's not a ready-made answer. It's like in various systems, you have all these, you have these systems of thinking about what a body should do. So that what a body could do, or what might a body be able to do, it already has ready-made answers and kind of ready-made templates of what it should be doing. Like, for example, when you were talking, I was thinking about performative empathy and virtue signaling. Performative empathy and virtue signaling, which you must see a lot of in the community over there in Bali. Virtue signaling, right? Like, oh no. I mean, it's a thing. People talk about virtue signaling, but it's really a thing. Yeah. It's
yeah. And performative empathy, like you said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then just clearing the space for, all right, what can this body do? I like to say now that my hero is the stem cell. Because the stem cell, it's like sitting there in an embryo with all this massive shape-shifting potential. Like, it can become any cell. You know what I mean? And to me, that question, or that statement, I don't know who I am. Well, that's a good place to start. It indicates possibility, like possibility for innovation.
Yeah.
You know, like mobility. I can become, who knows what we're going to become today, you know, like in this conversation, who knows where we're going to be going. We've already cleared the space for challenging the rigidities of identity. And once we've done that, you know, we can really innovate.
Well, yeah. And I love, one of my favorite, I guess, questions to pose to my clients whenever they feel stuck is just ask yourself, what could be another possibility? What could be another perspective? What else? Just keep getting curious with yourself and with others and find something that feels right for you. But don't get stuck in, coming back to this word rigidity. Know that there's always other possibilities, but you need to ask yourself the question so that you're prompting your mind to go, what else? Actually, I didn't think of that. That could be another possibility too. Oh, that makes me feel a bit better. But people just forget to ask themselves that question. They forget to be curious. And I think curiosity is, something that it's one of my favorite things of being with my 2-year-old is that I consider myself to be quite a curious person. And I love to encourage and teach people how to be curious, be more curious. But watching the world through my son's eyes again, and it's just so magical. And to see his wonder and his curiosity at things that we take for granted and things that, we have forgotten to be in awe of. He's been such a refreshing reminder to me of how much more curious I can be with myself in the world. And it's super cool. It's one of the greatest blessings, I think, of having him around.
Yeah, the image of a child as a stem cell has been tripping me out lately as well, because, there's so much potential for becoming.
Yes.
And when you couple that with the imagination and with curiosity, you have a really awesome recipe for play and fun.
Yeah.
Right? Because we can be at the pool. Now I can be a hippopotamus. And like 10 seconds later, I can be a unicorn. And then I'm a princess. And then she's a hippopotamus and I'm a princess. And then it's all this fluid, just matrix of possibility where it can be, we could be anything, right?
I know. It's amazing. And we as adults, we lose that, and maybe we're not going to be princesses and hippopotamuses as adults, but I think there's still the possibility of becoming more you or more of what you desire, but we forget that that's a possibility because we're stuck in these rigid identities that we've put ourselves in. So we've grown up and put ourselves in these boxes, and then we're like, oh, okay, well, this is where I have to stay. And now there goes there goes my possibility. There goes my imagination. You know, there goes my play and my fun and all of these things. And so I think having a child is such a great reminder of like, but there are other possibilities.
Yeah. So you must, because you're a yoga teacher, trainer, and a coach, you must have people coming to you that are established in practice.
Yes.
They've been, cultivating a movement practice and mobility in their bodies. But because you've been developing this contemplative tradition and critical thinking, this must be one of the ways that you teach, right? Is kind of like, how does this show up? I guess my question is, how do the rigidities show up in your practice with teaching and in coaching with people that are really mobile? How does the hidden rigidity show up in their bodies and their minds? And maybe if you could give us an example, that would be great.
For sure. I'm just trying to think. So, I mean, I have like a coaching certification program where I teach existing coaches, yoga teachers, or health and wellness practitioners. So I've had naturopaths, kinesiologists, doctors, social workers, all sorts of people come through the coaching program. And then I also have a yoga teacher training program that is specifically for yoga teachers who want to understand the interlink between yoga and mental well-being and mental health. So there's two kind of separate areas that I guess I teach on when it comes to teaching practitioners. But I think the rigidity that I see the most, like if we're looking at the professionals that come to me who are already qualified in some way, oftentimes it shows up I get a lot of imposter syndrome, a lot of people who are trained in what they do. They have a desire in their heart to be of service, but they're just not good enough. They're not good enough. They don't know enough. They're not as good as the person they follow on Instagram who has 300,000 followers. They're not this, they're not that. So there's a lot of rigidity in the sense of boxing themselves into they limit themselves with the possibilities that they could have, for example. So that's, I guess, one thing that I may see. In other instances, I see a lot of rigidity in the sense of being really stuck in one way of thinking or one way of teaching or one way of helping, and not realizing that, once again, there are other possibilities to be able to be of service. And I'm a big believer in a very holistic approach to working with practitioners. I teach trauma-informed care in the sense of understanding trauma, its symptoms, the behaviors, the way that it can represent itself, looking at, systemic, generational microaggressions. We look at all of these things as part of the program so that people are more aware and can be safer spaces for their clients. But then we actually spend the majority of the rest of the program exploring different types of modalities and ways of thinking to encourage the practitioners to broaden their minds, to be able to not be so rigid in the way that they are being of service to their clients, and to actually be flexible and fluid and be open to multiple modalities, to be open to working with other practitioners, to really have this holistic integrative approach when it comes to healing. Because I think that, my bachelor is in health science. So I used to be a nutritionist before I did my master's in counseling psychology and went into the mental health space. But I'm a big believer in the fact that we're just all so interconnected, and you can't be so rigid as a practitioner to think that it's only this way that will help somebody. It's absolutely not. It is an integration of the whole, and to pull people in, like you said to me earlier, I think off the podcast, have I heard of craniosacral therapy? And I said, yeah, absolutely. And I've referred clients to have craniosacral therapy because I want them to do it as a part of the experience that we're having together. And that's something that I really try to teach and train our students on and fellow coaches on. Yeah, to be really objective and to be really fluid and flexible in their approach to helping others.
I remember running into the 8 limbs image when I was a yogi. And that was part of the movement towards more mobility for me, where I gradually started to think, wait, okay, it's not just the asanas. It's not just the postures, but in the postures in yoga are actually quite linear, right? Like, and then all this image of kind of like these images of kind of like the tree-like formation and Sushumna, the center, and all that centering stuff is quite good. But I really like the 8 limbs approach as a way to kind of diversify into, like, for example, with Jnana yoga, right? The yoga of wisdom and contemplation, that, hey, let's be mobile with yoga itself. I'm imagining you talk about the 8 limbs. Yeah.
Yeah. We talk about the 8 limbs. We look at the 3 gunas in relation to polyvagal theory, for example. So we explore like the way that can show up in yoga and the different states that we can find ourselves in and how they actually interrelate to those 3, to the different states of the nervous system, and recognizing when someone is in a sattvic state, being in maybe parasympathetic versus someone who's in a rajasic state where they might be in that fight or flight versus someone who's in a tamasic state where they're really in that kind of shutdown, and how you see those different states actually operating in times of day and qualities of food, and like all these different things have different energy states in yoga, whether they be sattvic, rajasic, or tamasic, but you see it in the body as it represents in the nervous system. And so I'm always trying to teach the students, like there's so much more. And so how do we teach our students as teachers, as practitioners, to explore it 100%, those 8 limbs, but also to, look at the 5 koshas, the 5 layers of being, to look at the 3 gunas, to look at, to really understand the Bhagavad Gita, for example, and to see like what lessons do we take from that, and how do we bring it into the real world, and how do we apply it to people who are struggling with, say, anxiety because they're running late into the yoga class and they've just had a fight with their partner and they were up all night breastfeeding their baby and then they had to go to it, and then all these things. How do we take all of this and then apply it to this person in a way that they can understand, not in a way that is, what's happening in some places in Bali.
Yeah. The 8 limbs have these deep underground roots in like the ancient traditions where you have these weird Shiva practitioners that are going to charnel grounds and meditating at cemeteries, and kind of some of them even carry skulls around and drink out of skulls and stuff like that. But you have these very strange, like, the tracing back to the Buddha tradition and the origins of Tantra and stuff like that.
Yes.
You have this weird kind of like interface with indigenous practices where you do see these images of like intense masks, and it's not just conceptual, right? Where it's turned conceptual a lot of times, where you have like Kali Ma or something like that is, something to talk about. But I mean, rarely do we see, an intervention where it's like, okay, go meditate at a cemetery on your death and think about maggots or something, or, here's a skull to drink out of. But that's in the roots of yoga, right?
Yeah.
Like this intense like meditation on death. And
I mean, also with Buddhism, it's they very much, there's a lot of meditation practices. I can't remember the actual name for it now, but the contemplation of death, I mean, it's something that I personally meditate on a lot, is not in an intense or morbid way, but I do it as a way to bring me back to what's important. Sometimes when I find that I'm getting caught up in things that don't matter, and I can feel it in my body, like I feel like I'm starting to get disconnected from my reality, or maybe I might find myself being a bit more like dissociating a little bit, or getting more irritable at little things. And I'll come to a meditation where I really contemplate on the temporarity of life and existence, and my life and the lives of the people I love. And I do it with the intention of connecting back to gratitude and to connecting back to what matters to me. Like, and it could be something as simple as, is the fact that me and my husband are not talking because we had an argument over the dishwasher, Like, is it really worth it? Maybe we could have an argument in the moment, but like, is it worth not talking an hour later? Like, no, for me, like if I contemplate on the temporarity of things, no, that's absolutely not worth it. Of course I want to go in there and hug him, like it just brings things back for me of like what's important. And I find it to be a really beautiful practice to help with gratitude. But I think initially people find it quite confronting because it's hard to not get caught up in sadness or in panic of the concept that, we're all going to die.
Yeah. I mean, it's easier said than done, this kind of like turning towards your partner when a rupture has happened, because there's so much intensity, right? There's just, it's really a gnarly moment. These common everyday domestic arguments where a Hiraman walks into the space and is in your body, right? And the mask is out and you're like, I shall withdraw my love from you. Like my little girl, she's playing with this really interesting space recently where she's like, if you don't give me cartoons, I'm not going to cuddle you ever. But it's so human, right? Because it's like when we're not getting what we want, when we're not in control, when the dishes aren't lined up the way that they need to be or whatever, this space is so powerful. And we can just kind of like categorize it. Oh, that's a regression or whatever.
Yeah, right.
But like, it's so intense. But it's very similar, right? It's like, if you don't do the thing the way that I want you to do it now and let me be in control, I'm going to withdraw my love, kind of forever.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And there's that, it's very much, you really see out your egos come out in those moments where we're having ruptures within relationship of, I think all of us desire to be connected and all of us desire to be accepted and loved and to fit in. And so whenever there's a misalignment of that or the possibility of that not being real, like even your daughter may be thinking, oh, if I get cartoons, it means daddy loves me. But if he doesn't give them, it means he doesn't. So I'm going to withhold cuddles. Like it's all to do with like our feeling of being connected, right? And then as soon as that's threatened, who we become in those moments is definitely that mask that can come out, as you said, or that's within us, where we either say things we don't want to say or we retract our love and we actually energetically withhold that from the other person and say, well, you don't have access to me anymore. When really in those moments, and those moments can, in my example, it can be something so small, but because the feelings are so big and that threat of losing love in that moment is so strong. And then who do we become when our attachment is threatened? And then it can go on for like hours unnecessarily when really you just say, can we just sit on the couch again and watch a movie? Like, I'm over this. Or like, what's for dinner, And I think it's quite a skillful practice to get in coupleship and friendship and all sorts of relationships to come together, to lean in rather than lean away, walk away.
Yeah, for sure.
It's hard to do.
I like thinking about yoga as an initiatory practice. The roots of yoga are designed to kind of feed this 8-limbed tree that is all about getting initiated into the wonders of existence, the powers of life and death, the mystery of it all. And to me, I've been playing with this concept of the initiatory illness.
Okay.
And I like telling students, I train psychologists, I train somatic students, and I'm a professor of neuroscience. But one of the things that I say is like, sorry, folks, like healers can't be taught. Healers are initiated. And what I mean by initiation is initiation often requires a molting.
Mm-hmm.
A molting. So yoga is like a molting posture. And so I'm curious if you vibe with that. Did you have your own initiatory illness? For me, it was, around the time when I was in Perth, when I lived in Perth, which we share that hub, I was suffering. Like, I was looking around feeling like an alien, not just because I was an American in Australia, but I felt like, I don't know, like I was leaving a trail of blood behind me or something like that. I felt like I was an open wound, and I was very socially anxious, and something wasn't lining up. Something in my psyche was saying, you are not in the right place. You need to mold. And I didn't know how to mold.
No.
Eventually I found yoga. So I started like the molting process, but that was like my initiatory illness, is like, I was feeling bad.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, and I really like the way you describe that, actually. I think we do all have something. I mean, I think for me, I've had a few different things that have accumulated over time. When I found yoga, I mean, I'd always kind of known about yoga and dabbled in yoga predominantly with my mom. You know, living in Bali as a kid, you're still exposed to it. And mom practiced yoga now and then, and I would join her, or I would come to classes sometimes and things like that. But it wasn't really something that took my attention until I was in a space in my life where, not dissimilar to you, actually, I'd been in Perth for a long time, but there was always something about Perth where I also felt like an outsider. Even though I had friends and I had a social life and I was in a relationship and I had a business and all of these things, I never quite felt settled there, and I never felt like I could truly be myself. And I felt like I was more and more trying to obtain an identity which fit in with the idealistic identity that many people had within the suburbs that I lived in, or within that area. So very much the identity of material wealth, of a certain type of like house, a certain type of car, a certain type of like, your kids would have to go to this school if they stayed here and marry this person. And like, there was a real kind of mold, I think, that was glorified then. And I could feel that I was thinking that I needed to fit into that mold. And so I was trying to like live my life in a way that would, whilst all the while feeling more and more and more lost and disconnected within myself. And it was a horrible feeling of this like duality or polarity of like, well, this isn't me, but like I'm trying to be this person and I feel really lost, but I have to keep up this facade of like who I am and what I'm doing and how I'm running my business and all of these things. And yoga actually became a space that I could just have like silence from it all, from the sense of like I could go in and I could just do my 75-minute practice and I could be on my mat and I didn't have to look at anyone else or think of anything else. And I could be so focused on my breath in the practice, which is probably why I was so drawn to like power vinyasa. I just wanted my mind to be like off for a second. And that it became like a sanctuary, I suppose, for me. And then I wanted to do my teacher training, initially just to learn more about it, actually. It wasn't initially because I wanted to teach. And then I fell in love with the process of teaching. It really helped me in many ways and still does. I find that yoga is something that it is such a rich, diverse, deep, philosophical experience. There's so much there. It's so old. It's so ancient that even though I've been teaching it and practicing it for 10 years, I still come across so many things every day that I'm like, wow, I never knew that. I never heard of that before. This is so cool. Or I'm learning this about this thing and I never knew that before. And how do I apply this to my life? There's so much contemplation you can do with yoga. And I really love that about the practice. And it's helped me a lot through some of the probably most difficult moments of my life so far.
Thank you for sharing that. You know, I'm thinking about other aspects of initiation and the roots of the tree of yoga. And one of the things that is there very deeply in terms of the ancient tradition is the initiation of the yogi into the secrets via sacred sexuality. And that, and the initiation in the ancient texts, like the Buddha Kapala Tantra, the origins of Buddhism and Hinduism at the kind of nexus of the two, is you have a woman initiator of the yogi.
Mm.
The woman initiator of the yogi. And then there's some texts that even say that this kind of Tantra woman initiated the Buddha.
Oh.
Via sacred sexuality. And when I say sacred sexuality, it's not the kind of clean, polished sexuality that's all no, they're like holding skulls.
Yeah.
And they're like basically doing necromancy, where there's like the secrets of the death and life. And, she's initiating the Buddha into the secrets, and so a lot of these things just get kind of washed out and under the polish of,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I just think it's just so rich. And like, so then tamasic or rajasic, they become conceptual. You know what I mean? Because have you heard of polarity therapy?
No, I haven't.
Polarity therapy is a body work that works with the gunas.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So, and this is what I was trained back in like 2001 or something in polarity. I lived in this healer community, and polarity is really interesting because you do weird things like pull on toes intensely and like deliberately kind of rail into toes so that a person is hurting. So it brings up their stuff.
Oh.
It deliberately is provocative.
Okay.
It's an initiatory paradigm in that way, because it's almost like saying, okay, we want you to molt the rigidity, and we're going to confront you with the limits of your window of tolerance. And in a way, trauma resolution can be packaged in that way. Hey, let's explore the traumatic material. Let's get things stirred up, but not too much and not too fast. But like, we kind of got to stir things up. We kind of got to get into this rajasic, tamasic space. We can't just go at it from the purity. We got to get in the muck. We got to stir things up a bit. And if it's not that, if it doesn't happen that way, then a person isn't ready to molt.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
Well, I was also thinking about this stuff must be in your blood, right? Because you were talking before about how your grandfather is a Muslim or was a Muslim.
Yeah.
And your grandmother was Christian. And this was a big deal in Indonesia, right?
Yeah, it was a big deal. I mean, it was a big deal in Indonesia. It was also just a big deal, I think, in their families. From my understanding, both families were very set in their socioeconomic class, as well as like their expectations of religion and who should marry who and how. And so, they really, I guess they really kind of broke that. They fell in love and were very much ostracized, I think, by both sides of the family, because I think my grandfather's side didn't want him marrying someone who is lower in hierarchy or lower in socioeconomic status than he was, and also a different religion. And my grandmother didn't want her marrying someone who was Arab, part Arab and Muslim.
So he was a bit unorthodox in terms of his thinking. Yeah.
Yes.
As a Muslim, he was.
Yeah. Oh, very.
Yeah. He was thinking outside the box.
Yeah, definitely. He was, I mean, I think my memories of him are very fond, actually. He was a very wise grandfather, very wise man. And I think he really gave me a lot of, maybe from the get-go, maybe my first real initiation into the work I love to do in compassion. Like, if I really think back, like maybe it came from him, because I distinctly remember probably being about 5 or 6 years old and him telling me not to worry about what religion I wanted to be, and not to worry, even though, we would go and sit in prayer and go to the mosque with him and the family and all of these things, even though we learned Arabic, even though we were engaged in like all the different kind of aspects of religion. He never forced it upon us, and he never like told us this is how you have to be or this is who you have to pray to. And he always said to me, read all of it. Read all of it. read the Quran, read the Bible, read this, read that, understand it all and take away all the characters and take away all the things and just see that the messages are usually the same within all of it. And just, be a good person, be a compassionate person. And ultimately that's what it's all about, and he never had any judgment around anything we wanted to do, which is, yeah. And it's actually interesting, Brian, like talking about this. I think this is the first time I've actually ever been like, you know what, like maybe he actually played a really pivotal role in this now. It's not something I ever considered in my teens or even my 20s. But now that I'm really sitting at it and looking at my work and looking at the way that I kind of share my beliefs, I think a lot of it is very similar to how he was. So it's really nice for me to have this little moment of realization now and be like, oh, isn't that interesting?
I just got the goosebump response. And yeah, the goosebump. So like the tingles, I'm really interested as a researcher actually in the tingle response when it happens.
Oh.
How it happens, what is the meaning of it?
Yeah, what is
I personally think that pretty much all my peak experiences as a seeker are cluster around moments when I've had the tingle response. Can you vibe with that? Like moments of like in the bhakti branch, branch of yoga, just being in that space of reverence, and it's even happening now, right?
Yeah.
Being in that space of reverence where I'm singing, and I'm just emptying out through the singing and I become pure sound.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah,
I've become pure sound. And it's like, sometimes I have that moment on the dance floor where my moving body is just moving sound.
Yeah. I know what you mean.
And I'm being moved by the sound and my body is a kind of expression of that sound.
Yeah. No,
I'm so glad that arrived as an experience for you in regards to your grandfather. I think, this is really a space for honoring the elders. I think there's something of a stem cell wisdom because religions had to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
That had a shared root somewhere. It's like,
Yeah. I think so. I think
and
so.
I think, and actually, weirdly enough, my research has taken me into strange pockets of literature where there's, for example, studying chimpanzee behavior. And chimpanzees will actually get the tingle response when they are confronted with a powerful force of nature like a waterfall. And they'll start to get into rhythmic, what's called pant hooting, which is like, I'm not going to try to, but it kind of is self-explanatory, the term pant hooting, right? So there's this rhythmic intensity that's coming through and they get goosebumps. Yeah. And so in the literature that I was reading, they're actually positing that, like our cousins, our close genetic cousins, chimpanzees we're exhibiting and do have a kind of stem cell-like quality to the religious instinct. That when confronted with a waterfall, something, rises up in them and they become this community unit of praise and this kind of collective spirit. And I just find that to be so wonderful. So that's my riff on tingling.
I mean, I would say I even get goosebumps when I see a waterfall, if I'm thinking about it. Yeah, like I get very like in awe of nature, especially when there's like vastness or bigness. Like if I'm looking over the ocean, for example, and it's just like so vast and there's so much of it and it's all I can see, like I get overwhelmed kind of by the experience of witnessing that I'll get goosebumps. Same thing with waterfalls, same thing with like sunsets. If I'm looking at a sunset and then the sky is just like all these different colors, like I'll get overwhelmed with that feeling of awe that I get goosebumps in those moments, which is really interesting. But also like, when you're saying that the chimpanzees all had that collective sound they made, it reminded me of just being in a room where people are chanting, humans are chanting collectively, whether it be, the Om sound, or whether it be any other form of mantra or even song, and any culture, not even yoga, any culture where people are in harmony, there is that feeling of like, wow, this is cool. This is everyone in sync with one another. And that's a pretty incredible thing to witness and to be a part of.
And it's really interesting because that experience can't be it. We can't just say, okay, we're going to have the tingle response now.
No.
And so therefore we'll do this practice and kind of structure it in a cookie cutter manner. Mm-hmm. You can do things that can make it be more likely perhaps, mm-hmm. but it's not like you can say, okay, all right, Nikki, somewhere in the middle of the conversation, we're going to talk about your grandfather and do the tingle response thing.
No, exactly.
Yeah. Would you be willing to say his name?
His name is Muhammad.
Muhammad.
Wow,
isn't that interesting? Because, part of the stem cell in terms of the anthropology of religion, in the Islamic tradition, but in the roots of the Abrahamic religions are actually in magic and in angelology and in Zoroastrianism, which is this deep magical tradition that traces back to India, and there's a deep substrate of an orientation to the magic in life. So Muhammad, when he was visited by the angel, okay, this was a felt sense of presence of the magic coming into the cave. Gabriel, the angel, comes in, and there's this insight that comes in, and then Muhammad molts. Mm-hmm. And then, you have these structure, and then, similar thing with Christianity, where you have the magi coming in from the East, and then you have the angelic traditions of Christianity, and they have a deep substrate in what's called Platonic Orientalism, that kind of deep root, a deep connection with the magic of the great everything. But then the religions come and they structure it and they fuck it up.
I know.
And it's just like, so Muhammad, your grandfather, carried some of this stem cell wisdom. And I just think that's genius. And some of the part of the heterodoxy of Islam, where you have figures like Rumi and figures like Ibn al-Arabi, who deeply influenced James Hillman, by the way. Have you ever run into the work of James Hillman?
No. Should I?
James Hillman's lovely. He's very deep, iconoclastic, Jungian psychologist who really looked at the orthodoxy of Jungianism and was like, folks, you need to get more STEM-like with your imagination. Like, it's not just the archetypes, it's how magic comes into the human, how magic populates our body with various intensities and expresses itself in the really rich realm of the imagination. So, Ibn al-Arabi and the creative imagination and everything was really this carrier of, hey, there's angels trying to make their way in, not angels that are just trying to build more structure and more structure and more structure, but the real presence of the magic of life that makes us tingle and come alive.
Yeah.
And we all have our own angels that bring us somewhere where we're looking at the sunset, or we're in the middle of an asana and the body starts to tingle. Like, I'm thinking about a moment where I'm looking out, I'm at Heartwood Institute back in the day with Bruce Berger, the polarity therapist, who'd been teaching me and pulling on my toes and stirring shit up for me. And I'm like looking out at the horizon, and I'm in a warrior pose, and it's just this magic. And my angel comes, am I going to build a religious structure out of it? Maybe in my 20s, I thought I was, I'm like, I'm going to be the next guru that does, like everybody does this, like that, and try to reproduce it.
Yeah.
But then it took me a long time to figure out that's not the way.
No, I love, thank you. It's really nice to hear it in that way as well. And to also, I just love, whether it be magic, whether it be angels, whether it be whatever, like however people see it, I think it's just so nice to like follow those things, those feelings, those moments, right? Like they're so special.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about, just in terms of grandfatherly energy, I'm thinking about Gabor Mate.
Yeah.
Who you've done a lot of.
Grandfatherly
Right?
energy, for sure.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about the grandfathers of the trauma resolution tradition, Gabor Mate, and Peter Levine.
Yeah.
These are like these founding grandfathers, and now kind of Bessel van der Kolk to some extent.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit about your experience with Gabor Mate.
Yeah.
And what made you come alive.
Yeah, it was a beautiful training. I came across it really randomly. So it's a training that he's brought together himself and Satnarang, who is actually a naturopathic practitioner and a Kundalini yoga teacher. And I guess she, and I might be wrong here, so don't, people have to look into this if this is right or wrong. I think from my understanding of it was that they became friends, or she was a client of his or something along those lines. And she started becoming fascinated by the way that he helped people. And I think she approached him about helping to teach others this way that he kind of fused together the wisdom of the body or the beliefs that are in the body with someone's trauma and the idea of becoming compassionate, and the invitation to become compassionate to it. And I think when you see Gabor in action, he can be sometimes quite ruthless in the way that he can get straight to the point, but people feel very safe in his presence and people feel very held in his presence. And there is very much that grandfatherly energy that he admits and he has. And I think that in itself is a skill as a space holder to really just exude an energy where someone feels incredibly safe to just be with you and to be exposed in your presence. He really taught and focused, and they're different facilitators and also it was a long program with lots of practical training within the peer sessions and what have you. But it was very much this kind of, what are you feeling, or what's the trigger, or what's the memory? Where do you feel it in your body? What's the sensory experience within your body? And then treating almost like parts work in a way, like treating that part of your body or that sensory experience as its own identity, getting to know it and understand it, getting to understand when it first developed, like, what's your first memory of it? If it had a voice, what would it say? What are the beliefs? And is it ultimately true? And then kind of bringing it back up to the adult cognitive mind to be able to then meet it with compassion and to kind of neutralize it in a way. Like, of course it was there because you were 4 and it had every right to be there. Or of course you're still holding on to this because da-da-da-da-da. So it's like that kind of compassionate approach of, like, something he always says in the course is, like, you're not bad or wrong. Like, no one's bad or wrong for anything that they feel or do, because everything has a reason. And if you can meet it with compassion, then for the person, the shame that they feel about that, kind of disappears and they can see it a lot more clearly. And I guess looping back to something you and I spoke about very earlier, therefore come the possibilities. When someone can see something more clearly, they can say, well, what do I want to do about this? Or what are the possibilities in front of me, rather than being kind of blinded by their shame or stuck in their own kind of cave of shame or unknowing. So yeah, it was a really, really fascinating and interesting course. And it really added a lot of interest for me in the mind body, I would say, like somatic psychotherapy sense of it. So like looking at sensory experiences in the body and seeing them and witnessing them as their own belief systems, so to speak.
So this is the compassion-focused therapy approach, yeah?
Yeah, so they call it compassionate inquiry. I think compassion-focused therapy, I think that was more Peter Gilbert. Was he the person who kind of like came up with compassion-focused therapy as a model? And I don't know how much somatic work is in compassion-focused therapy, but it's very much around the same notion of like meeting yourself where you're at and kind of just, compassion's not wrapping yourself up in toxic positivity, and it's not sugarcoating things, and it's not telling yourself to find the silver lining, but it's also being able to see a situation for what it is and to validate yourself in that and be like, well, yeah, like it did happen then. Like you were that way when you were 20 because that's all you knew when you were 20. Like, of course you were that way and you're not that way now. So like, let's move on kind of thing. Like there's this very kind of practical element of it of like, I see you, I hear you, I validate you. And also like, is that who you want to be? And if not, like, let's continue with life.
I really like how you mentioned the term fierce when referring to Gabor Mate, and that it's a cool juxtaposition, fierce and compassion. I love that juxtaposition because then you have this warrior function, where it's there's a fight in there somewhere. Fierceness is a type of fighting.
Yeah.
It understands that there's parts in us that are aggressive. Hello.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I think a lot of the time when we had to watch so many videos of him in action, so you get quite familiar with his style and observing him. But there is, like a warrior. It's kind of, it's like being in the presence of a warrior. You feel safe. And also, that they are incredibly strong and incredibly direct. Like he's incredibly direct. But people are willing to go there and willing to be vulnerable because they feel safe in his directness, which I think is, like you said, a juxtaposition. It's very cool to watch. So it was a wonderful experience. I did it throughout my pregnancy, actually. Was when I did the course before I was pregnant, and then I found out I was pregnant during the course, and then all the way up until birth. And then Bodhi was a little compassion inquiry baby that sat on the Zoom calls with me.
Nice. I'll always remember this. I have this image burned in my mind's eye of a pregnancy yoga class with a woman in warrior pose, breastfeeding at the same moment.
Oh, wow.
And it just gives me tingles again, right? Because you have this wonderful juxtaposition of care and nurturance with the warrior spirit.
Warrior, yeah.
And she had it nailed too. She was like in that space. I just find that so wonderful. Now, not an ideal. I think this is, now let's not be idealistic. This is why I love the title of your book, Good Enough. Thank you. That image is good enough, and it might be an ideal image, but how it lives in reality is through this image. And I really love the good enough. That's the compassion piece.
It is.
Is it a good enough human? And we have such a tendency to other people, right? I mean, all it takes is somebody to cut me off on the freeway or something like that to be
I know.
That mask comes on and I'm like, and it's easy to other them, but they're just a person doing their thing on,
Yeah. And I think it's really hard, I think the whole process of compassion, it's one of these things that it sounds easy, but it's actually really hard to do. And I would say I've been practicing it and learning it and applying it to my own life for many, many years. And it's helped me immensely personally to be more compassionate to myself and others. And also the compassionate part of me allows me and gives me permission to be human, to have the moment where I'm annoyed at someone for cutting me off on the freeway because I skipped breakfast and I didn't sleep very well and I am irritable, and it's going to happen and that's okay. And it's just like being okay with it. It's okay. It's enough. And I really hope, that readers can go through that book and they can just find a sense of relief. Really is just like, you can exhale. You don't have to stay on this hamster wheel of trying to fit into these boxes and doing all these things. Like you can have a goal, you can have a dream, you can have desires, and by all means pursue those goals and dreams and desires, but don't do it at the compromise of your self-worth and your inherent value.
How did he juxtapose fierceness and compassion with the bigger picture stuff on planet Earth, or did he? The big traumatic events, the genocides, the horrible.
Yeah. He spoke a lot about the residential schools and everything that happened in Canada. I think that was a big part of like what he was speaking about in the program with example. This was more so like examples of sessions that he was running with other people who had a lot of trauma from those experiences. But he didn't speak about worldly topics to us as students per se from that kind of viewpoint. It was more so what we would observe in recordings of him helping others through it.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Probably a wise idea to not get too political.
Yeah. I would think so.
Yeah.
I would think so, yeah.
Is there any place where, because, sometimes I think it's our job and it's baked into the fabric somehow to kind of like, as the next generation of trauma resolution practitioners, to bring things a little bit further, hopefully with humility. You have any places where you kind of disagree or you feel like you have an innovative package that's in your book that you have a outgrowth of a new direction, an innovation that you're offering that's distinct, maybe not separate, but distinct from the grandfathers and the grandmothers?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to like see yourself, if that makes any sense. Like,
yeah,
it's hard for me to like
totally
witness my own teachings.
What is my innovation? Totally.
I mean,
it's hard to define.
It is hard to define, and it's hard to see like myself objectively in that way and imagine like if I was learning from me, what would I find unique? I mean, I do think that I like to really balance the spirituality side of things with the science side of things. Like I like to have a fusion of that. I like to think and lean into things like hope and faith and trust as means to also get us by. But I'm also like I think I mentioned earlier, how I meditate on death and dying and temporarity. Like I do talk about that a lot as a way to kind of like rise above and as a way to overcome, in the sense of I do think that if we can do it safely and do it in a way that is of good intention, it's one of the few things that we know for sure, like 100%, is that we're all going to die and we're not going to be in this body as we know it anymore and be in this experience as we know it anymore. And I think that can be used as a very powerful tool to help give us the willingness to change or provide the gratitude that has been lacking, or the desire to reach our goals, or the courage to be more, to fall in love, or like whatever it might be. It's like, I think when we can really see how we can get so caught up in like just the everyday stuff that just doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter actually. And I think that like that's probably something that I really, even in my book, I teach all of these 4 steps on like how to understand yourself, how to navigate it all, how to like, different practices, different behaviors that come from trauma and how it all fits in. And at the end of the book, I kind of say in a way, like, and then you just also have to think that you're only here once. And so just make the most of it.
Yeah.
Let's enjoy it while you can, if you can, and choose, like recognize that you're more powerful than your thoughts, and you're more powerful than your fears, and you're more powerful, and you can choose. Like you have the ability to choose how you want to see something, and harnessing, I think, that power, and whether that be like a spiritual kind of way of looking at things, I think it just helps us live with more peacefulness.
Very cool. You have any words of wisdom for the aspiring yoga teachers, somatically informed coaches, and folks out there on the path that might be out there looking for somebody like you to help shape and mold and help them to mold? Any final words of wisdom for those folks?
I mean, I would just say to just be curious. I think that curiosity is a wonderful skill as a practitioner. And it helps us in so many ways. It helps us in our personal development to become safer, better teachers and practitioners. It helps us to develop our professional development. It helps us to not be egoic in our beliefs and our, it helps us to see more clearly. It helps us to be more collaborative, to refer, to do all these. I just think being curious is a wonderful skill. And if more practitioners could be more curious, I feel like, there would be a lot of a different way of being and treating other people.
Thank you so much for that. It's something that I really admire. A lot of my grandfatherly, grandmotherly types really embodied what I would call a playful curiosity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And carrying this kind of gravity about them, this gravity. It's not just playful curiosity, but like a depth that you so eloquently named, that death is right here next to us. It's a companion. Yeah. It's not really worth getting all gnarly about the dishwasher, even though that's just human. So that's good enough is good enough.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And it's this real balance, right? And that's it's good enough. And also just remember that we don't know how long we have. We just don't know. And so it's really this balancing out of being human and then realizing, how do I best enjoy this human experience that I have this one time that I've got it? How do I make the most of this? Because I've got one shot, as it is. So let me accept all of these parts and then, let me just choose. Once again, this power of choice. Let me choose to enjoy it.
Well said. Well, is there, how can folks find you besides showing up in Indonesia and looking for, somebody with a little Hulkster?
I mean, they can connect with me on Instagram. It's just my name. It's Nikki.Heyder. Otherwise, the book Good Enough will be available. I'm pretty sure it'll be available worldwide as of mid-October, which is exciting. So it'll be on Amazon. And I think I'm recording the audiobook version of it next week. So that will release in January in 2025, I believe. So I guess my Instagram is probably the best place to go. And then they can kind of go from there.
Congratulations, Nikki, on the book. It's a huge endeavor. Congratulations.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me on here tonight.
Yeah. And hopefully maybe someday we can have a cup of tea in Indo.
Absolutely. Yeah. Or in the States. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, great to meet you. And thank you so much for being on the show, and blessings on your good work in the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Boundless Body with the Somatic Doctor. Please leave a comment, subscribe, and like us on social media.
We're a swarm. We're a colony. We're a multiplicity.
Until next time, be well.